urban and suburban landscapes, what can go wrong? And I'm going to try my best to finish by on time. So I figured we'd start just by setting the scene of, what does a suburban forest landscape look like? And one possible way to think about it is this spot here in Rockefeller State Park Preserve in Westchester. It's a beautiful spot. There's, fall trees coming up pretty soon. This was taken a couple of years ago. And if we think about Rockefeller in particular in this case, and I'll return to this a few times in the presentation, it's a large-ish park, 1,700 acres of preserve land. There's more than 200 species of bird that have been recorded there. So it's an Audubon important bird area. There are many different habitats, different forest habitats, working agricultural land, wetlands, etc. And it feels sort of embedded within this forested matrix. On the other hand, it is actually only 35 miles from downtown Manhattan. And if we zoom out and think about it in a larger context, here's Rockefeller State Park Preserve. Again, we would see that, yes, there is a lot of forested area around it, but there's also dense suburban areas such as Sleepy Hollow, Tarrytown area. We have Hawthorne and Thornwood region, Ossining to the north, several roads bisecting the forest to fragment the forest. Zooming out even a little further, and here's Ossining and Tarrytown for reference, where even, we're not, like I said, not that far from downtown Manhattan. So we are close to this very hyper-dense metropolitan region. So what can go wrong in these types of landscapes? Here are 4 things that I have listed. There are many other things that could go wrong. And I will focus primarily on invasive species today, because that's one of the major areas that I study. But we'll also consider some climate change effects, fragmentation effects, and I won't have time to get to it today, but we do also have nuisance species effects. So specifically in these landscapes, we're often thinking about deer overabundance and some other nuisance species. And I distinguish invasive and nuisances. And invasive species are nuisances by the definition of invasive species that we would use, but nuisance species can be native species as well. So let's start with invasives. So it doesn't take very much for us to see that invasive plants seem to thrive in our forests. In just this picture of an edge of a forest, we see almost a dozen invasive species that are doing quite well, invasive plant species. And invasive pests do quite well too. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that later, I believe, from Dan or Marjorie. But here, just as examples, we have our Asian jumping worm, spotted lanternfly, and emerald ash borer, all of which are devastating in their own ways to different environmental situations. So why might this be the case? Why would invasive species be particularly bad in a suburban urban matrix? So I just want to think about this from the lens of one particular species, glossy buckthorn. I happen to study this for my PhD, which is why I always come back to it. But if we think about glossy buckthorn as an invasive, it was first established in the 1880s in our New York metro area, specifically in the areas around the shipping industry there. And what we see as it spreads throughout the landscape of North America is the pattern is dominated as spreading out from this urban area and then big jumps to other urban areas and then continuous spread from those urban areas. So when you think about urban/suburban landscapes, you should be thinking about non-native species because that's where they establish first in these major urban areas, primarily around areas of trade. So what are some species that we should be concerned about and thinking about? Well, we have kudzu at our doorstep, particularly with climate change effects. So kudzu can completely change the structure of a forest. These are all pictures from the south, but we have seen several observations of kudzu in southern New York and southern Westchester area. Kudzu can occasionally eat cars and homes. which is also fairly devastating. And just as an example, here's that home in the summer versus the winter. So makes it a little hard to maintain property value when your house looks like that. We have other examples like Japanese barberry and its interaction with human disease. So Japanese barberry is a great place for white-footed mice to live. White-footed mice are really good at carrying deer ticks around and transmitting Lyme disease to deer ticks, and Lyme disease is really crappy when you get it as a human. In fact, Lyme disease, at least in 2002, it is estimated that it cost over $203 million nationwide. So in direct and indirect costs of treating Lyme disease. So forward that 20 years, and I think we could all agree that that sum of money is probably larger today. So one of the major challenges with invasive species is as they become more prevalent on the landscape, any particular species, it becomes more expensive to manage the negative impacts. So this chart is fairly, you've probably seen it, or many people have seen it, but on the x-axis is time. So as time increases, your area of infestation increases and your control costs increase. And then there are these sort of arbitrary cutoffs of, we could prevent invasive species. When they're low in abundance, we can eradicate them. At some point, all we can do is contain them. And then beyond that, all we really have left to do is asset management. Historically, detection of invasive species often occurs around this period where we're transitioning from the eradication to containment possibilities. And public awareness has historically really not happened until we've gotten to this long-term management situation already. I think we're making really great strides with this through education and outreach resources. And I think spotted lanternfly is a great example of a kind of all hands on deck response to an invasive species, where we are really trying to push public awareness to the point where we may actually be able to eradicate or at least contain some of these detrimental species. So I am going to share this slide deck with Hillary later, and she can share it out with everybody who's registered. So in here just has a number of resources for how we would identify and learn about invasive species. And this is a subset of the many opportunities, but some of them are specific to our region, including the Lower Hudson Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, which I'm quite active with, and New York IMAP Invasives and the New York Invasive Species Information Network. So these are all good resources for education about invasives. I briefly mentioned LH PRISM, which is a group of organizations here in the southern Lower Hudson region, which includes Westchester. So this just includes several partner groups, such as CCE Dutchess, CCE Westchester, CCE Putnam, Rockland, are all part of LH PRISM, and a number of other organizations where our goal is to leverage our resources as partners to address the negative impacts of invasive species and protect the region. For anyone who actually wants to do things on the ground, rather than me who just does modeling and sciencey stuff, there's also this New York Invasive Species Information site, which has species-specific information. And one thing that's particularly good here is they have best practices for control methods. So you can look up your species and then you can look up your control methods, what control methods are out there. So in the brief time I have remaining, I just want to address the climate change and fragmentation effects and how they interact with things that can go wrong in our forests here. So the established models at this point suggest that our region, and this is for New Hampshire here, but this is true of New England and New York writ large, that our region will become more and more like the Virginia and the Carolinas over the next 50 to 100 years. So for all of you who know about plant hardiness zones, you know the plant hardiness zones have moved up already, and they will continue to move up over the next century. Now, what that means for, say, invasive species in particular is that as the region becomes warmer, there are more invasive species that are likely to be able to establish in this region. Here, what we're seeing is the current conditions on the left-hand side and conditions that we might expect with 3 degrees centigrade of temperature increase. And specifically, I just am highlighting here, we have increases in the number of plant invasions we'd expect in southern New England here along the coast, and in central New England here in that southern northern forest area, if you will. So what can we do about that? Well, we could take it home, frankly. We could start gardening with climate smart native plants in the Northeast. So there's again, in the presentation, there's a link to the materials here. This was put together by the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Group out of UMass Amherst and USGS. And this is a list of plants that are good in our region and should be resilient to these climate change impacts that we're expecting. So these are things that you might consider putting into your gardens and around your homes. Thinking about our forests, it also behooves us to have some information about what we expect different species to be doing. So here's an example of sugar maple and what we expect sugar maple to do in the coming 40 to 50 years, and where sugar maple habitat will be good, if you will. And I picked sugar maple because it's obviously an important species economically in New York with the amount of maple sugaring that occurs here. And this has been done by the US Forest Service. And there are a number of species that are listed in this climate change atlas. All right, super briefly, let's talk about fragmentation. We think of fragmentation as often as fragments of forests that are fragmented by roads, and that is completely fair. In this case, we see here is our Rockefeller State Park Preserve again. We do see our fragments here, forest fragment here, separated by roads, sometimes major highways. There's also fragmentation caused by things like power lines, right? So there's a power line right away up in Teatown Lake Reservation in Lower Westchester. This is a bit of an odd fragment because while it has fragmented the forest and has negative impacts on the forest species, it also creates a habitat that's quite beneficial underneath those power lines, which is a shrubland habitat. So not all fragmentation is necessarily equal, but still, if our focus is on forests, then we need to keep this in mind. Something I've been working on in my own scholarship is fragmentation caused by recreational trails. So this is a picture of one of the carriage roads in Rockefeller State Park Preserve. And what we see is that the canopy cover underneath or near the recreation trail is much more open than that in the forest nearby, if you just walk into the woods nearby. And this has fairly profound effects, as we've seen, on the percentage of cover of native and invasive species, native and invasive plant species. It is affected also by different locations. So that's because of past land use, different current land management strategies. I will point out here that what we see largely is that invasive coverage is currently lower than native coverage in our region, which is great. We're really excited about that. But we also see that higher intensity fragmentation, such as carriage roads versus hiking trails, leads to greater impacts. But that I do want to emphasize that there is an impact of all of these types of recreation trails. All right, so I will skip to the end here. No, here we go. Quick few seconds. I'll also point out that we can think about this on a bigger scale using resources from New York IMAP Invasives, where we're thinking about prioritizing for regions. And in this case, we can think about what are the effects of fragments on the spread of invasive species. So in this plot, we see the deeper red colors of places that are more likely to get invasive species through the spread along roads. And then if you combine that with things like whether the preserve is protected and how important it is ecologically, you can get prioritization scores for which areas should we be most concerned about. And the deeper, darker reds here and here are areas that we should focus our efforts on, or at least consider focusing our efforts on, and protecting these forests from, in this case, we're combining fragmentation, we're combining invasive species spread, and in the future, we'll be able to add to this climate change effects. That was 15 minutes and 57 seconds, Hillary.
Thank you very much. So we do have a question, but we'll hold on to it until the end.
Okay.
And everyone who has questions, feel free to put it in the chat box. And we'll be able to go through them all after. And Dan, looks like it's your turn.
Okay, I will get started then. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides here and what I'm trying to show. Starting to come up here. Okay, let's go back here. Okay. All right, very good. Okay, so you can see the title slide, I guess, here. All right, great. Thank you for joining us, everybody, and much appreciated. Nice to be with you for a while. Marjorie and I run a diagnostic lab at the Long Island Horticulture Research and Extension Center, where we get samples mostly from commercial entities, but we also have a home horticulture diagnostic lab. You have excellent staff here, of course, in Westchester, and I encourage you to develop a relationship with your diagnostic lab staff who can help solve problems, identify issues, invasive species, and so forth over time. So work with them as time goes on to figure these things out, and they can help you a great deal, and also alert to any new things that are going on or changes in the environment to maybe help you be aware of things too that are new and coming along. One thing, just to give you one example, this is a couple of samples that I've received. One is on basswood on the left, and one is on European on the right. These are two different areophyid mites that are causing the symptoms you see on here. And the people that were finding these were very concerned that these were presenting a risk, health risk to the plants, that they looked strange and usual, hadn't seen these before. But these really aren't a problem for the plant. They don't really threaten the health. They're something that I would consider normal. And that's the kind of thing that a diagnostic lab can help you understand what you're dealing with and whether it's something to really worry about or something new that is invasive that we haven't seen before. And after this webinar, there's a lot of references available to you besides of course, the diagnostic lab. This is a list of a few here that I show. If you had to get only one, I would suggest the one that's on the upper right. The Garden Insects of North America is a really excellent guide with lots of color photos. There are some other ones too. I realize we also have the internet that you can go to, but I spend a fair bit of my time correcting myths that come along and providing correct information to things that people have learned from the internet. So I would suggest consulting references here, and keep the internet a little on the side as not necessarily the most authoritative source for all the things that you maybe want to know. So at least among the things that we can do to keep our landscapes, our urban forests healthy, is to pay attention to the care of them. Most attention is being paid, in my experience, to the care of turf grass and lawns, and often at the expense of the trees and the shrubs that are really so valuable and so important and form the structure and the bones of our landscapes. In this particular case, this is a landscape here that has a drainage problem. You can see there's two drains that are installed, one in the driveway, one in the lawn, and a beautiful yellowwood tree that is dying because it's been heavily attacked by ambrosia beetles that favor flooded roots, and a close-up of some of the roots, which also are showing other problems like a girdling root there, as some other issues that this particular plant had right from the day it was planted. So giving the plant, the trees and shrubs, the kind of care and paying more attention to what they require would help them immensely. And I think we would see a lot fewer of these problems coming into the diagnostic lab. And taking care about the kind of chemical applications that are made, and even some that are well-meaning, can be important. Here on the upper left is a beautiful Sergeant's weeping hemlock that was treated with a horticultural oil in fall, which is not a good time to use the oil on an evergreen conifer. This is for hemlock woolly adelgid. It was a problem that they needed to control, but that application would have been best made in the spring. On the right, an application was made in the spring, but it was made just prior to a period where there's extraordinarily high temperatures, unusually high, and that caused the burning that you see there from desiccation. So just being a little careful about those kinds of things. Also, soil tests are really rarely done. I talked to very few people that have done any of these in landscapes before making any kind of fertilizer amendments or applications or recommendations. These could be done a lot more often and would be helpful to inform what kinds of things are needed or missing. And I think could help contribute to fewer outbreaks of things like scale insects and aphids that benefit greatly from the excess nitrogen that's being put on the lawns surrounding the infested trees and shrubs. Doug Tallamy is an entomologist with University of Delaware and is becoming, and as an exponent of the ecological side of our managed landscapes, and promotes the idea of looking at our landscapes as the benefits they provide to the environment in an ecological way, as well as to us. These are areas we live in and not just look at, and that's the same for the wildlife and other creatures that are surround us. So as admonishes us to think of our landscape as a bird feeder, and if you want to help birds, then control the plants in the landscape. Caterpillars are especially important for birds. They provide both protein and carotenoids that are really essential nutrients in the diet, and they do much better. They produce more eggs when they have a good diet full of caterpillars. And among the plants that provide those would be oaks, and they top the list here that he compiled of the plants that have different kinds of caterpillars that feed on them. You could see there's others in the list that are pretty good too. So you could choose, just as an example, plants from these lists that will be better for supporting the kind of birds and some other wildlife in the area. And he's got a book that came out early in March, Nature of Oaks, plus one of our other local arborists has a book on oaks too, if you're really interested, Bill Logan, who works in the New York City area. And it's not just the caterpillars that are on the trees and the shrubs that are valuable, but there's other things that are bird feeders in our urban environment, around our urban trees and shrubs. And there's just a selection right here. So some of these might be considered pests, but also start thinking them not just as pests, but as some things that provide food for the wildlife that we value so much in the area around us. Lawns are not looked at as contributing a whole lot, but they in fact can. And this is one paper from University of Kentucky that found over 50 pollinator species associated with dandelions and clovers that were allowed to grow in residential lawns. So the perfect lawn is often looked at as one that doesn't have any broadleaf weeds, but maybe we need to rethink that and the way we look at our environment. Also, if you're interested in pollinators, there's a bunch of excellent references, including on the web. This is the one I provide here, and I'm showing a selection of late blooming plants, buttonbush, goldenrod, and clethra, that are excellent for supporting pollinators, which usually suffer from lack of blooming plants later in the season. So these would be examples of things, and all native, that you could grow and specify in landscape designs or management or areas for restoration, for example. So I think it's all leads us to rethink how we look at our landscapes, and a place like this may be something nice to look at, but is really doesn't offer anything for the wildlife and in terms of the birds and pollinators that we'd like to see. There's really nothing there for them in a place like that. Just a few examples of some things that we are dealing with that are invasives, and our urban and suburban forests connect very closely with the wild native forests around us too. And this is one of those examples, emerald ash borer, which is now tearing through Westchester as well as much of New York, including Long Island. We're seeing quite a bit of that in our area. The trees on the right are dead. The ones on the left are in the process of dying. You can see some that are almost dead further down on that road. This is just taken in the Riverhead area. So these are in decline. There's a lot of ash that are planted along the roadsides in our area. This is not a native forest tree, and we're losing them. This would be a good argument to not plant so much of the same kinds of trees, which is a lesson I thought we'd learned with elms years ago, but it doesn't seem to have been learned. This is a case for maybe having arborists employed by municipalities who can oversee the planting, replacement, development, and maintenance of our urban and suburban forest areas. They can take responsibility for that and see that the things are being done in a good way over time. So we have the more durable and resilient kinds of urban and suburban forests that we really love. This is just another example of a hapless European birch, and these were widely planted in our urban suburban landscapes years ago, about 30 to 40 years ago, and they're almost all dead now because of a native insect, the bronze birch borer. So there's native species that we can plant instead, such as river birch, that are resistant to this. And I don't advocate planting a lot of these to the exclusion of everything else, but they can provide an alternative that will thrive and do much better compared to some of the thing that is susceptible to a native pest that tends to kill them. Arborvitae is a native plant and is very, very widely used and sometimes forced to grow in areas that it never would have done so in the first place, but it's pretty resilient and pretty tolerant. And here it has some problems with Arborvitae leaf miner. And you can see that they're trying to grow these in an area with very narrow root space, very narrow growing area itself, so they can't get too big before they outgrow the area where they're intended. But this is something you could be encountering just right now. We get a lot of questions about this. And the key to dealing with this is knowing that the moths are out in late June. And that's about the best time to control it if you want to use something that's natural. Product containing spinosad would be perfect for dealing with this if you get the timing right. If you miss that timing, you would have to use something else to control it. And that's not as friendly to the environment. This is another kind of symptom of drought stress that looks very much like Arborvitae leaf miner, but just shows that this is something you could mistake for the same problem, but why it's important to get a diagnosis to be able to distinguish what you're dealing with so you take the proper measures. In this case, you would try to address this through mulch, irrigation, other things that could improve the situation for the plant that's causing the drought or the other kinds of stress. Gypsy moth is one we've had a lot of questions about, especially this year from Eastern New York and the Adirondacks, Eastern Adirondacks, Saratoga, also parts of the Finger Lakes, and we've had outbreaks certainly in the Southeastern New York region in the last 5 or 6 years or so. This has been a really bad invasive pest, fortunately mitigated by the a fungus that has come in to help control it, but doesn't appear every year reliably when it's a problem. So that getting the timing right and control means you can use some safer, more gentler products such as DT insecticides if you treat when the larvae and the caterpillar is just still pretty small. So that can be an important one to deal with, get the timing right as well. Gypsy moths here have been killed by entomophage fungus, and we do see that coming in the last couple of outbreaks on Long Island. That has brought it under control, so watch for that as well. So we tend to see that more in springs where the weather conditions are fairly cool and moist as the caterpillars reach larger size. We had a lot of complaints about this one this past year. This is a native insect, the dogwood sawfly, and this is on midwinter fire, a Cornus species that we've got here right at the research station, but there was a widespread regional problem with this. And this is another one that's fairly easily controlled with spinosad insecticides, or one that you can remove by hand. This is a plant that's become more widely used in landscapes, and I think it's great. It's pretty tough. It doesn't have too many problems. This is just one that we do see, especially late in the season, causing some defoliation on it. Another example of one that we deal with is this cottony taxus scale. We see this on a variety of different landscape trees and shrubs, and these are the egg masses that are troublesome, mostly in late May, early June, and you can see the eggs are hatching. There's lots of tiny little crawlers that are on the leaf there. One way to deal with this is to time an application with horticultural oil in the early spring for the overwintering stage, which you can see here looks very much like that. You sometimes see a natural fungus coming in and bringing that under control, and this is one that's on a very similar related scale, turning them into these white powdery masses. These are the crawler stage that come out a little bit later in the spring. This would be about in mid-June or so. And even just blasting these with a jet of water will remove a lot. Or you could use something like a horticultural oil or insecticidal soap that should control that. But again, getting the timing right on this would help to get the best level of control. And looking for these helps you know when that happens. A plant that's becoming more widely used, more widely planted, it's not native, but seems to do well and provides pollinator resources also late in the summer is crepe myrtle. And this is the variety Natchez, which has beautiful fall color and bark as well. But we're seeing problems with crepe myrtle aphid on it, and especially other varieties. Natchez seems to be a little less prone. So it can get these absolutely enormous populations that people are needing to treat using things like neonicotinoid insecticides. So the solution to this might be to choose varieties that are a little less prone, and there's a list of 5 of them that I have on the upper left that could be options instead of growing some of the other ones that seem to be more prone. The lady beetle has come into the area and is one that we're seeing pretty widespread around New York now. We've been dealing with this by releasing biocontrols, and you can see there's a little wasp where the arrow is pointing that is attacking one of the lily leaf beetle larvae. So we know some of this have been released in the Hudson Valley region as well, and we have some optimism based upon what we're hearing that they seem to be established and are starting to bring this under control. Just a little bit here, last couple one, spotted lanternfly is on its way, and you've been hearing a lot about it. I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot more about it in the coming few years. It is now pretty widely established in the region, not established in Westchester as far as we know, but we're getting reports, sightings of them there. There are some surrounding Westchester, as you could see in Rockland and Orange County, also in Connecticut as well. And we have some on Long Island, all throughout New York City. So this is spreading, and it will be coming to you fairly soon and establishing there. This will be a problem. We don't have really very, I would say, good solutions for this, but there are things you can do. And the New York State IPM website is a good reference on that. This is the kind of thing that you'll be seeing probably within the next 3 or 4 years, these very, very high populations. And without their natural enemies to bring them under control, this will be a little bit of a difficult one that we have to deal with. Another one to watch for is box tree moth. This was found in Western New York and has been introduced on boxwoods sent in from a Canada nursery this past year. Some were intercepted on those boxwoods, but some may have made it out. So I just like everyone to keep their eyes peeled and watch for any kind of defoliation on boxwoods. And if you suspect that, get in touch with Amy or Hillary and let them know, and they can follow up on that and let us know, and we'll figure out what to do about it. But this is a new thing that we are expecting to see that will start to be spreading in the coming years. And just a couple of suggestions on things that you can do to improve the ecological benefits that our environments provide, just to increase the structural complexity and the biodiversity, and add flowers that provide not only on bloom, but are helpful for natural enemies that we like to have around in our landscapes as well. And I think with that, I will end and hand it off to Marjorie. Mm-hmm. And we'll take questions right at the end here when you're ready.
You are still muted, Marjorie.
How's that? Did it
Perfect.
work?
Yep.
Good. I had to unmute myself twice. I don't know why that was. Probably Dan put a hex on me, I suspect. Okay, so hello everyone. This is going to be the disease portion of your What Can Go Wrong talk. And it fits right in with everything else because diseases are very invasive things as well. Some we've been dealing with for years, so we've gotten used to them. Some of them are quite new to us. Those are even scarier. And I don't have a lot of time to teach you about diseases today, but I thought I'd give you some examples, give you a little feel for how they can be managed and coped with, and let you know what's going on with some of the newest things today as well. So just a quick comment on spring diseases. We're not in spring anymore, but we do have a lot of problems that tend to focus on spring conditions. And one of the most familiar ones is this. It's called brown rot, and it tends to affect cherries, especially the Kwanzaa cherry that I think we could safely say was overplanted in the past 100 years. And the symptom is a canker disease where the stem tissue is what's affected more than the leaves individually, but clumps of leaves that are attached to a particular stem tip will wilt all together and then turn brown. And this is something which is tolerable if there's a little of it, but is really quite damaging if you have a lot of it at one time. And what's happening on cherries, or in this case, this is from an apricot, you have an infection at the flowering time. And it can even be done by the nice pollinators. They can carry disease organisms around. In this case, it's a fungus organism. And you will have infection that starts through the flowers themselves and moves down the flower spur and gets into the stem. And this type of thing is always worse when you have very wet, rainy weather like today. So you'll see a variation in this from one year to the next, and you'll ordinarily be able to cope with it just by pruning out the portions of the tree that are affected in dry weather, making sure you're getting well below the area that's affected, because physical removal of a disease problem is a wonderful way to control a disease problem. It's not the ultimate best. The ultimate best is changing the plant so it's resistant, but it's a really great method for keeping diseases in check. And the alternative would be doing things like pruning out those areas and just dropping them under the tree, which I'm sure none of you would ever do. But that's also scientifically not a great idea, because the inoculum can then just splash back up into the canopy and allow more disease to develop. So you'll have things like this disease going in the springtime. You'll have anthracnose diseases going in the springtime, and some of the leaf spots, botrytis, blight. There's a whole host of things that can happen in the spring. But I thought today, since we were in the fall, we would talk about some of the things that would happen as fall diseases. And in particular, this is a good time to talk about powdery mildew. This is one of the most conspicuous diseases. So I expect many of you are familiar with it and have seen it many times before. And one of the plants that's the poster child for powdery mildew is lilac. It almost always shows this disease by this point in time because it's such a favored host of this type of fungus. One thing to mention quickly is that if you see powdery mildew on, let's say, a Monarda plant in your perennial garden or on a London plane tree, those are also powdery mildew. They're also fungi, but they're different ones. These things all look alike to us. They're white, they're powdery, but they have very complex genetic differences that we can't see. Fortunately, they tend to respond to the same control measures and certainly to the same fungicides, but there's a wealth of taxonomic diversity out there in the pathogens as well as there is in the plants. So let's just think a little bit about what happens with the lilacs. Erysippus syringae is one of the main powdery mildews that will go to that plant. And when you see white on an infected plant with a powdery mildew, this is what you're looking at. And just to make sure you understand the perspective, at the moment you're an ant walking across the surface of a leaf. And as an ant, you're not very tall, and you see these chains of sort of clear things that shine in the light. And these are the accumulations of spores in little towering linear units there that are coming up from the leaf surface where the powdery mildew is growing. This fungus grows across the surface of the leaf and puts little suckers down in to obtain its nutrition. That's why it's so obvious to us, and we can see the white mold on the leaf. Many of the diseases are doing the same process down inside the leaf tissue, and we look at then the plant symptoms rather than seeing the fungus itself that's causing the problem. With the lilac powdery mildew, we can not only see the white spores, but in the fall of the year, if you look closely now or later, you'll see little black specks on top of the white areas. And those are structures called chasmathecia. And there's a little diagram here of one that's particularly ornate. They are little round containers that hold special spores inside them that are sexual spores that take this fungus through the winter. And that's why we always recommend to you that if you're managing your garden, you collect the fallen leaves, particularly from plants that have a powdery mildew problem, because then you can specifically bury, burn, or bag and send off inoculum that would otherwise get the disease started all the better the next year. You can never do this perfectly, but you can certainly dent the level of disease by that practice. Then there are also things that you can do with powdery mildew that relate to applications. There is everything from things that you might Google up online that are home recipes using baking soda and a little dishwashing soap, to use of straightforward fungicides, to this was some experimentation we did years ago looking at sun spray oil, which is what the SUNSP is at the right. And I just wanted you to see the benefit of applying a chemical for reducing powdery mildew. This blue line at the top shows you how much powdery mildew there was without any treatment. And all these other lines are much lower, and they're showing a depression of the amount of disease, the visible amount of disease after making that application. And this is why we use pesticides, but I do question whether we necessarily need to use pesticides when we have a disease such as the powdery mildew on lilac. Every lilac gets powdery mildew. It's long after the flowering period. It's not going to come in on flowers that you would bring into your home. So I think we might want to, in this instance, just practice some tolerance, which is the same message you were getting from Dan earlier. To some degree, these things are natural and they're not doing a lot of harm. They don't make the plant die. They don't make it drop its leaves. This is going to vary from one powdery mildew to the next. One that affects a different kind of plant might be much more injurious, but we know from long experience that on lilac, it's not that bad. And then we also have choice because we're the gardeners. So we can go into learning about the different cultivars of lilac and choose to grow ones that are different from the Syringa vulgaris, which is the type that has the real sensitivity to the powdery mildew. You can get away from the kinds of things that you see. This is the nickel, is just to remind me, this picture was taken at Monticello. We can get away from this conspicuous look if we don't like it. And again, here's just a little data from years back when we looked at different kinds of lilac and compared them for their susceptibility to the powdery mildew. And up at the top, you see some that are relatively susceptible, like Edith Cavil and Prince Charming. And then there's some that were in sort of a middle category, like the nice purple Arch McKean, Lilac Sunday and Cheyenne. But then there were lilacs that we tested, which were hybrid type lilacs, which were just free from disease. So if you hate powdery mildew on lilac, you can grow a minuet or a Miss Canada or a Palaban or an Agnes Smith and just get away from the problem. And this will give you, I have a few pictures of these plants to show you. They have a different leaf type, but the floral type is very similar to the lilac that you know and love. That's the Syringa vulgaris. Here's the Agnes Smith, a little bit of a rougher leaf, a larger leaf, a little longer leaf. Here's Miss Canada. Here you have Miss Kim, which is probably the most popular of these other kinds of lilac that you might put into your landscape. We have one at the Long Island Horticultural Research and Extension Center that is just going gangbusters. It doesn't get problems. It's wonderful. Here you have Palaban, which is a Syringa Meyeri, just a different species of Syringa. And here you have the Minuet, which is another one of the Prestonii hybrids. So if you learn about a particular group of plants you're interested in, you will be able to learn about choosing plants that are less susceptible. And that genetic difference is the best way to control the disease. It's very long lasting and dependable compared to almost all the other things we might do. Another group of fall diseases are the rusts. So I thought I would mention some of those for you. Hollyhock rust is probably the one you would be most likely to know about. It causes just little yellow or orangey spots on the top surface of a hollyhock. And then if you're curious enough to turn the leaf over, you'll see little bumpy pustules on the underside. And that's where the spores are produced that allow this particular disease to overwinter. And again, it's a problem that you might want to gather up the foliage and the stems from one year to reduce the problem the next year. This can also be dealt with by growing unusual types of hollyhock species that are not as prone to this rust problem. Otherwise, it's really common on hollyhock. Doesn't kill it, just makes it ugly later on in the season. Rose rust is one you might see occasionally. The name is sort of interesting here. It's a phragmidium. Actually, probably 10 different species of phragmidium can affect rose. And the symptom in this case are these little dusty piles of spores that are orangey on the underside of the leaves. This isn't a common disease in our area, but we see it occasionally on every several years. Geranium rust, we don't see terribly often because the geranium production industry tries so hard to keep it out of production. It will cause little spots on the top of the leaf, and then the fungus which causes the rust disease is able to form spores on the undersurface. They're chocolate brown spores. They'll take on, first you'll have one tiny spot, and then there'll be like a ring around that, another ring around that. So you get a target shape as the spores accumulate. This is a disease that if it does get going in your geranium area, can be really damaging because with lots of rain, you can have many cycles of infection from one spore production to the next. Snapdragon rust is one that we see particularly in beds of folks who are growing snapdragons for cut flowers. Here's the look on the underside of the leaf. The top of the leaf hardly shows anything, but again, you'll get these very dark brown pustules of powdery spores on the undersurface. And I have to offer this to you as a daily double, because if any of you listeners today happen to see this disease this year, I'd love to hear from you because I need that as a backup to a rust experiment that I'm already doing this year. One last picture of the snapdragon rust. And then I'll put this in front of you as a mysterious thing that looks like it came from another planet. Hopefully you've all noticed this and already know what it is. Looks sort of like a golf ball growing on a red cedar. This is on Juniperus virginiana, and it's a rust spore stage. This particular rust is a especially interesting one that forms a gall as part of its life cycle. And that swelling after 2 years of growth on the juniper will get to be an inch or an inch and a half across. And then it grows to the point of sometime in May when we have very rainy weather. And under rainy, cool conditions, it will start growing little tentacles out of each of those bumps that you see there and create quite an impressive view. And then the spores produced there will go over to crab apples or apples and cause these leaf spots. So you have the strangest kind of life cycle you can imagine, moving between a juniper for part of its life cycle to a crabapple for the other part of its life cycle. And we need a resistant crabapple or a resistant juniper to break that cycle. The timing of this means that you'll see those really gooey tentacles that I mentioned on the juniper sometime, usually in late May. And that's when you need to apply a control measure. If you're doing chemical control against the disease, that's when you need to have fungicides applied to the surface of the foliage of a crabapple. Again, getting back to the earlier point, the best way to control this disease is to use a crabapple that's resistant to rust. And within the cooperative extension information, there are long lists of crabapples that are not rust prone. So if you're bothered by this every year, branch out and get yourself a new crabapple. That's the best thing to do. Also, if you happen to have one of these plants, a little red cedar, growing 10 feet away from your crabapple, you might want to consider getting rid of the red cedar because you're just really facilitating the movement of spores from one plant to the next by having them close to each other. Quince rust is another very similar kind of rust fungus disease, and that one has slightly different symptoms on a juniper host that cause slight swellings. This is a spindle-shaped swelling, we call it, with a little orange ooze on a juniper, and this could be Juniperus virginiana again, or some other species of juniper. And then the symptoms on other plants are usually plants in the rose family, and you'll see sometimes these strange kind of symptoms, these little white vases sticking out from the fruits on an amelanchier or on a hawthorn or on a crabapple. And this is the way the quince rust produces spores on its rosaceous host. And then the disease will move back and forth with this as the spring symptom on the rosaceous plants. And then you will have the maturation of galls on the juniper that takes some time. On the quince rust, it's a perennial thing. So once you have that on a trunk of a juniper, it's going to keep giving you rust spores forever and ever until you cut the tree down, basically. And then the most recent rust to our area is one that affects pears. This affects the calorie pear, which we don't like anymore because it's a very invasive plant, but we don't like them sick either. So just to make sure you understand what's going on, there's again a juniper to pear rotation with this particular life cycle for this rust disease. And you'll see canker type infections browning on the tips of the Robusta green juniper in particular. And then this time of year, if you look on the underside of spotted leaves of the pear, either an edible pear or the Bradford or some other calorie pear, you'll see these little swollen areas. And those represent a spore structure of that rust fungus that occurs on the pear between usually September and December here on Long Island. And then I'd like to move from those problems to two things that are very much in the news now to help you know a little bit about those. The first is boxwood blight that we've been dealing with for about a decade now. Here you see some boxwood that aren't really looking very well at all. A accumulation of browning in the canopy can mean there are insect problems such as the boxwood moth that Dan just mentioned, or also conceivably boxwood leaf miner. But the third possibility is a fungus disease that's been new in this country for a few years now, and it will cause defoliation of boxwood. Everything above ground can be harmed. We often see it across the top of little hedges. Here's a tiny hedge, here's a bigger hedge. Obviously, this is really devastating. So in a very fancy landscape with a lot of maintenance, there might be a fungicide spray program to protect the plants. But again, we're working very hard to develop new boxwood that are resistant. There's a program at the National Arboretum and a program at Saunders Brothers Nursery in Virginia, developing new boxwood. And the first of these are the new gen boxwood that are superior in their resistance to this particular fungus disease. Sorry for those flashing slides there. The symptoms are dark spots that you'll see on the foliage, sometimes completely dead leaves. And this is my best diagram to show you if you were trying to identify the disease, you'd look for some black rimmed spots, and you would also look for, on the current season shoots, some little black stripes that run along the axis of the shoot. The combination of those two symptoms is a good indication that you are dealing with the fungus disease, the boxwood blight. And again, to repeat Dan's point, do use the Cooperative Extension Diagnostic Lab and their access to Cornell University to find out what the mysteries are in your garden, because if you don't know what you have, you cannot fight it correctly. You don't want to be using an insecticide on a fungus problem that has a simple cultural solution, for example. This is one of the publications that we have available at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Suffolk County here. That's about boxwood pests and diseases on Long Island, and you have the same ones in Westchester. You actually have very similar boxwood problems there. So if you'd be interested in looking at that website, you can find out a lot about other boxwood problems as well. And then the ultimate newest problem that we're fighting, and I was out in the field looking at a test area only yesterday for beech leaf disease. This is a problem that was not known anywhere in the world until very recently. And now only Japan and the United States have had outbreaks. The first place where it was seen in the United States was around Lake Erie in Northeastern Ohio, and it crept from there into the western part of Pennsylvania and into the western part of New York. And it's been moving ever since, unfortunately. It took until 2019 before people realized that this was a nematode disease, that nematodes inoculated onto healthy beech would cause this symptom. And this darker green between the veins is something you could probably see if you walk outside anywhere in Westchester County and find an American beech today, because unfortunately it's very common there, just as it's very common on Long Island ever since 2019. This is a very new disease that we know only very little bit about. We know it's associated with these nematodes, which are tiny microscopic worms you can't see with your naked eye. We don't know how they move about from plant to plant, but they're doing quite nicely getting from place to place. We suspect they could be shipped easily with nursery stock, perhaps with bonsai, maybe just blowing on a day like this in wind-driven rain. They are certainly getting around. And we've noticed that the buds are very important for this disease. We started out focusing on those little galls that make the stripes, but now we understand that the nematodes go into the buds for the next year in the fall, and they live there around the little immature leaves. And then you can see the striping as soon as the leaves open up in the springtime. And it really doesn't change over the year. You don't get more stripes over the course of the summer. You will get stripes that become more vivid with time as the leaf turns greener. But those strange little stripes, by and large, are going to be evidence of beech leaf disease, and you just need a lab to confirm it for you if you're not sure. This is the kind of look you'll see over the next month or two as the trees start going into their fall color. the little galls where the nematodes have been living start becoming all the more conspicuous. They start out dark green and they'll tend to become a bright yellow now. Unfortunately, one of the few things we know about the disease at this point is that it does also go to the European beech. So if you have the European beech ornamentals, they will show very similar symptoms, but with slightly different coloring, perhaps darker purple bands between the veins. And people are scrambling to figure out how to control this and working with what we have available now in an attempt to get the disease to be checked so that we can maintain, in particular, our large ornamental beech of either the American beech or the European beech varieties. So that's ongoing. And I know you all have questions about that because I have questions about that. But that's what I have for you today. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then we can all see each other. And perhaps someone's going to run us through some questions off of chat.
Definitely. Yeah, we have a bunch. I'm excited to start going. So the first question is, should we be planting ahead of where we are? So seeing as we will eventually be more like Virginia or the Carolinas, should we be planting more for that climate than ours currently?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pamphlet that I referenced in my talk, and that will be linked in that talk, suggests not necessarily planting ahead so much as planting species that are robust to multiple hardiness zones, including southern zones. So you're looking for species that their hardiness zone is maybe the coldest one we're talking about is ours now, but they have a range for warmer. So I mean, one other thing to keep in mind with that, though, is that when you have plants that you're taking care of, they will do better than their, native range. So you can expand the zone a little bit in both directions if you're like taking care of the plant by watering it or covering it in the winter. So yeah, so you don't need to don't plant a full Virginia garden in your backyard. Just plant trees or plants that are robust to multiple hardiness zones is the recommendation.
Great. And I will say really fast, it is 1:02. So if anyone who does need to leave, this is being recorded and it will be put on the Westchester CCE website. So we'll definitely get to all the questions now, but if you do have to leave in a week or so, it will be up if we do miss a question you might have asked. Great. The next question was, what is the reasons why recreational trails result in more invasive species?
It's mostly just that's where they get spread. So if you think about mountain biking, hiking, horseback riding, seeds get on your feet, seeds get in the horseshoes, and then you spread it that way. And then there is a slight, for the carriage roads, for example, there is a slight, we suspect there's a sun effect as well. I mean, we know that there's more openness, and we suspect that's leading to more edge species, which many invasive species get a foothold in on edges.
Okay, and there's another one. Are there any examples of multiple municipalities engaging in arborists being used as a shared service? And they were talking about both for interaction with homeowners and support for these municipalities. And I can start off by saying a lot of municipalities in Westchester do have an arborist on staff, or they hire an arborist as someone who can help them through projects like they had mentioned, street trees, things of that nature. If you're looking for an arborist for somewhere on your property, there is the International Society of Arboriculture, and the website there, and I can give that, is nysarborist.com. And you can look for an arborist for our area. We're in zone 3. You can look for an arborist who is certified and would be able to help you around your property as well. Did anyone else have anything to add to that?
I just think it was a good suggestion to have arborists shared for municipalities or areas that can't afford maybe to pay for their full services, but you may be able to share one if you're adjacent or nearby. So that's good suggestion though. Good idea.
Okay, so the next one, ladybugs are effective on aphids with aphids on roses. Has that been tried at all with crepe myrtle?
Not to my knowledge that release has been tried, but I don't think they're likely to work. The ladybugs that are in our environment mostly don't seem very interested in the ones on crepe myrtle that I've observed, with the exception of the invasive non-native multicolored Asian lady beetle. They are voracious predators of the aphids on crepe myrtle. So they seem to be going after them really seriously and are helping to reduce the numbers. But in the case I've seen, they are not really up to the job, not when those aphids are at such high levels as they get to be over time. So you'll probably need some help to reduce them. I've also seen chickadees actually going after those aphids when they're in such high numbers. Strangely enough, they'll be interested in aphids when they're in their high levels like that.
Great. This one, can we educate the many landscaping companies to encourage environmentally sound goals and practices?
That sounds to me like what cooperative extension is always trying to do. So
it does,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's certainly a goal, and all of our programming is trying to encourage people to open their minds if they're shut at present to doing things in a holistic way, to use integrated pest management, and to reduce just plain old chemical pollution, which often is related to using the wrong thing at the wrong time anyway. So getting your diagnosis correct in the beginning is also really important for that.
And a lot of those get access to that information through their civic associations, in this, like New York State Arborists, Long Island Arboricultural Association, our case, and others, that New York State Turf and Landscape Association in Westchester. So I encourage people to look for those kinds of credentials in the people that they engage for worker services on their property. And that suggests sort of professional interest and motivation towards self-improvement and education, because things are constantly changing. We have trouble keeping up with it all the time, and that's one way that they can help themselves do so as well.
Okay, Marjorie, the next one's $1 million question. What is the status of treatment solutions for beech leaf disease?
The status of treatment solutions for beech leaf disease. We're still borrowing from other systems at this point. So the one thing that's labeled is the same treatment that would be used against emerald ash borer, which Dan mentioned. Imamectin benzoate injected into trees. This is not something we're going to be able to do in the forest. There are too many trees, and you actually can't even inject a tree unless it's at least 4.5 inches in diameter. It's just not recommended. So that's a solution for certain very valuable trees in the landscape. And then anything else is pretty much just being done by creativity. If there are things that are labeled for use on beech, they have some logic to them as also being inhibitory to nematodes. There are some arborists trying other things as well. People who are currently controlling mites, for example, might find there's a side benefit that could hopefully reduce the impact of the nematodes. And people who are trying to control the Phytophthora canker disease on beech are using a chemical that is a phosphorus acid, and that has a natural improve the plant's own resistance aspect to it. So there's some hope that that would be beneficial also at reducing the impact of the beech leaf disease. That's not a good enough answer. We need more, but we also need time. And it seems that it's having huge impact on the trees quickly. I mentioned we were looking at them yesterday, and there were trees in the landscape we were studying that it's a very wooded landscape, but they're showing in some cases 15% of the canopy they should have, and only maybe 1 or 2% of the leaves look normal. So we're wondering if those trees will be there next year. So that's after something like maybe 5 years or 6 years of exposure to the problem. And the first 3 years they didn't notice they had it. So the graph that Matt showed you earlier is very relevant. The public becomes aware really late in the process, and sometimes even the scientists aren't aware early in the process. And this one really pretty much caught us, I think. came on
And
very quick.
Marge, I would say that the treatments you've mentioned, right now, we don't know if those are going to be highly effective. We're still trying to learn if any of those, the
Absolutely.
trunk injections or any of those.
Mhm.
So the question is still out there, are any of these going to work? Is that correct?
If you're approached to cure your beech tree, do not hire them. If you're approached by an arborist who says they will try to do everything that's scientific for controlling the bees, then you might want to hire them, because we are in a situation where we don't have data, even unpublished data, that shows benefit from any of the treatments that are being tried. They're just optimistic things based on what we know about nematodes and what might retard them.
All right, the next question, is there anything we can do to strengthen a tree's immune system? Someone had said that mushrooms help to fortify the human immune system.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some kind of fungus in the soil that might be helpful?
That's a really interesting way to ask that question. And mycorrhizae certainly have some benefits for tree health in some cases. So there might actually be a fungus connection that would help tree health. And then I'd also mention the chemical that I alluded to earlier, phosphorus acid materials, which would be things like K-phyte or phosphite, are having a benefit on plants' immune systems. They're different from ours. It's not a standard immune system, but we know that it does in general help plants resist disease. And usually that's at some price, like the plant won't grow as fast as it would have otherwise. It's also not 100% effect, but we're learning more about these kinds of things all the time. And boy, someday I do hope we'll find there's a friendly fungal inoculant we can put into the soil that will make the entire tree do better.
Great. And then I think we have one more. Matt, I know you already answered it, but if you can just answer it out loud. So it's, if I plant Appalachian flax, it might do better in the future. But what does that mean for our local pollinating insects?
Yeah, no, and I did answer that in the chat, like you said. I think for the general species, it'll probably not have much of an impact, but you do want to be mindful of more specific species, more specific pollinators. And some work, actually, I think Dan mentioned Doug Ptolemy's work. He's shown that as you move species around, you dramatically decrease the interconnections among species. He was specifically talking about non-native species, but that's true for moving southern species north. So I think you really want to be mindful of having an array of what we would say locals and maybe the southern species coming in as you're doing this. It should be as gradual a transition as we can make with climate changing as rapidly as it will be, if that makes sense.
Great. And that seems like it is the end of the questions.